Most killers don't plan to get caught, but sometimes they make one mistake after another. And in this case, every mistake pulled investigators one step closer to a horrifying truth. A missing young woman, a boyfriend who appeared calm, almost too calm, a family that refused to believe the worst, and a trail of evidence that, piece by piece, exposed a crime far more disturbing than anyone imagined. What investigators didn't know at the time was that while they were searching for a missing person, the man responsible was already trying to erase every trace she had ever existed. This is the story of Alexis Gabe, a case where a simple breakup spiraled into one of California's most disturbing homicide investigations. January 26, 2022, it seemed like an ordinary Wednesday evening. 24-year-old Alexis Gabe stopped at a gas station in Antioch, California, filling up her car before heading to one last destination. Moments earlier, her phone buzzed. A message from her boyfriend, Marshall Jones. "Are you still coming over?" Alexis replied that she could only stay for a little while. Nothing about the conversation sounded unusual. Nothing hinted that these would be some of the final messages she would ever send. Just minutes later, her vehicle pulled into Marshall's driveway. No neighbors noticed anything strange. No one heard an argument. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked like another normal visit between a young couple. But inside that house, everything was about to change. Friends later explained that Alexis had already made her decision. Their relationship had become unhealthy, arguments had become common, trust had disappeared, and that night, she planned to end it for good. For Alexis, it was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter. For Marshall, it may have felt like the end of everything. Hours passed. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, surveillance cameras captured Alexis's car leaving the house. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but investigators would later notice something important. The person driving didn't follow Alexis's normal route home. Instead, the vehicle headed in a completely different direction. 12 minutes later, the car entered a quiet residential neighborhood several miles away. Then something happened that would become one of the biggest clues in the entire investigation. A person stepped out of the driver's seat. The figure wore dark clothing, their face was hidden, and based on their size, it clearly didn't appear to be Alexis. The individual calmly walked away, leaving the vehicle behind as if it had simply been abandoned. A short time later, Alexis's phone received another message. "Did you make it home?" There was never a reply. From that moment on, Alexis Gabe vanished without a trace. The next morning, her family immediately sensed something was wrong. Alexis wasn't answering calls. Her phone went straight to voicemail. She had missed plans, she hadn't contacted anyone, and according to the people closest to her, that wasn't like her at all. As the hours passed, their concern quickly turned into panic. Eventually, they contacted law enforcement. At first, officers approached it like many missing person reports. Adults disappear for countless reasons. Sometimes they simply need space. Sometimes they leave voluntarily. But Alexis's family insisted this situation was different, very different. They believed something terrible had happened, and they knew exactly where police should begin looking. During the initial interview, Alexis's family revealed something investigators couldn't ignore. The last person known to have seen her alive was her boyfriend, Marshall Jones, but there was something even more alarming. Family members claimed they had previously heard Marshall make disturbing threats. According to them, if the relationship ever ended, someone was going to get hurt. Whether those threats were serious or simply emotional outbursts, police couldn't say, not yet, but they immediately understood one thing. Marshall wasn't just another witness. He had become the most important person in the entire investigation. Within hours, officers arrived at his home. If Alexis had left safely, Marshall should have been able to help investigators understand where she went next. Instead, they encountered someone whose behavior immediately stood out. Marshall welcomed officers without hesitation. He answered questions. He spoke calmly. He even tried making small jokes during the conversation. At first, that seemed cooperative, but experienced investigators know something many people don't. It's often not what someone says, it's how they say it. Marshall didn't seem frightened. He didn't appear desperate. He wasn't asking officers to find Alexis. Instead, he acted almost detached, like someone discussing an inconvenience instead of a missing girlfriend. Still, police continued listening, because sometimes people reveal the truth without realizing it. Marshall explained that Alexis had come over that evening. They spent a few hours together, watched television, talked, played video games. According to him, Everything was completely normal. Eventually, she left on her own. He claimed she planned to meet a friend afterward. That explanation sounded reasonable, at least, until investigators began checking the evidence, because evidence doesn't forget, and unlike people, it doesn't lie. While officers interviewed Marshall, another major breakthrough happened several miles away. Alexis's family had organized their own search, driving through nearby neighborhoods. They suddenly spotted something unbelievable. There, parked along a quiet residential street, was Alexis's car. The discovery instantly changed the investigation. Police secured the vehicle and transporting it for forensic examination. What they found inside raised even more questions. The driver's door had been left unlocked. The keys remained in the ignition. Several personal belongings were missing. Nothing about the scene suggested someone had simply parked the car and walked away forever. It looked staged, carefully, deliberately staged. Investigators then examined the vehicle's digital system. Modern cars quietly record far more information than most drivers realize. Navigation history, movement, travel routes, time stamps. Together, those records created a timeline impossible to argue with, and almost immediately, Marshall's version of events began falling apart. The vehicle hadn't traveled where he suggested. Instead, its final confirmed location before being abandoned was his own house. That single discovery transformed everything. Marshall was no longer simply the last known person to see Alexis alive. He had officially become the primary focus of the investigation, because if he wasn't telling the truth about where she went, what else was he hiding? And investigators were about to find out. By the next morning, the investigation had already taken a dramatic turn. Detectives now believed Marshall Jones wasn't simply the last person to see Alexis Gabe alive. He was hiding something. The only question was, how much? Rather than confronting him with everything they knew, investigators chose a different strategy. Sometimes the fastest way to catch a lie is to give someone enough room to keep talking. So detectives returned to Marshall's house. This time, they weren't just looking for answers, they were looking for cracks in his story. Marshall greeted the detectives with the same calm attitude as before. He insisted he had no idea where Alexis was. He claimed he'd been trying to call her. He even showed investigators text messages that appeared to support his story. On the surface, it looked like the behavior of a worried boyfriend, but detectives noticed something unusual. Marshall spent more time explaining why people shouldn't suspect him than expressing concern about Alexis herself. It was subtle, yet experienced investigators recognized it immediately. Most innocent people focus on finding their loved one. Marshall seemed focused on protecting himself. Detectives carefully walked him through the timeline again. Every detail mattered. Every minute counted. Marshall repeated that Alexis arrived that evening. They spent time together. And eventually she left without any problems. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, nothing unusual. At least, that's what he wanted investigators to believe. Then detectives asked a simple question. Would you mind if we took a quick look inside the house? For the first time, Marshall hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, only a few seconds, but sometimes a few seconds say more than an entire interview. Instead of immediately agreeing, he explained that the house belonged to his stepfather. He couldn't give permission himself. He needed to make a phone call. Marshall stepped aside and called his stepfather. Detectives listened carefully. A few moments later, permission was granted. Only one detective could enter, the other would remain outside. It was an unusual condition, but not enough to refuse. The detective stepped inside. What he saw looked ordinary: a living room, a kitchen, several bedrooms. Nothing immediately suggested violence. Nothing appeared obviously suspicious, yet something about the house felt off. Marshall led the detective from room to room, almost like a tour guide. He pointed out bedrooms, opened doors before being asked, explained where Alexis had spent time. Everything appeared almost too controlled. Without realizing it, the detective was being guided exactly where Marshall wanted him to look, and more importantly, where not to look. Eventually, they entered Marshall's bedroom. The room was a disaster. Clothes scattered across the floor, empty bottles, random belongings piled everywhere. It looked chaotic, almost overwhelming. The detective spent several minutes looking around, trying to identify anything connected to Alexis. Instead, the mess itself became the distraction. No one noticed what was hidden above them. The attic remained unchecked, a decision investigators would later regret. After finishing the walkthrough, detectives still hadn't found enough evidence to obtain an arrest warrant, but they weren't finished. One investigator asked Marshall another question. Would you allow us to examine your phone? it was a significant request. Cell phones often reveal more about a person's life than almost anything else. Location history, deleted messages, internet searches, call records, photos. One device can expose an entire timeline. Most guilty suspects refuse. Marshall didn't. At least not immediately. To everyone's surprise, he agreed. He signed the consent forms. He promised detectives they could download everything. His willingness appeared genuine, but detectives had no idea Marshall already understood something they didn't. The phone itself wasn't his biggest problem. Something else worried him far more, something sitting just outside. After leaving the house, Marshall drove to the police station behind investigators. As officers watched him through their mirrors, they noticed strange behavior. He wasn't driving normally. His vehicle drifted slightly. He looked unusually nervous, almost distracted. At first, it didn't seem important, but once everyone arrived at the station, everything changed. One detective casually glanced toward the back of Marshall's SUV. Large blankets filled the cargo area, pillows, loose bags, random items stacked high enough to block visibility. The detective asked if they could take a quick look. Marshall's confidence disappeared. Almost instantly, he smiled awkwardly, laughed nervously, then began explaining why opening the trunk wasn't necessary. He insisted the vehicle belonged to his stepfather. He didn't feel comfortable letting officers search through someone else's property. The explanation sounded reasonable, but detectives noticed something. Marshall wasn't saying no. He was delaying, trying to control exactly what officers could see. Eventually, he reluctantly opened the rear hatch. Inside, investigators found blankets, food containers, pillows, general clutter. Marshall quickly explained everything. He said he and Alexis had recently gone to a drive-in movie. They used the blankets while watching the film. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. At least, that's how he described it. Still, detectives weren't convinced. One officer asked whether they could collect one of the blankets for DNA testing. Marshall immediately pushed back, not aggressively, just enough to make detectives uncomfortable. It was another small moment, another tiny red flag by itself. It proved nothing. But investigations aren't built on one clue. They're built on hundreds of tiny details, slowly forming one terrifying picture. Even so, Marshall eventually left the station. No handcuffs, no charges, no arrest. From the outside, it looked like he'd survived the first major hurdle. But investigators now possessed something far more valuable than an interrogation. They had his statements, his timeline, his behavior, and soon, they expected to have the complete contents of his phone. If Marshall had made even one digital mistake, they believed they'd find it. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. When technicians attempted to extract the data, the download failed. Hours of waiting produced almost nothing. The evidence detectives were counting on was suddenly gone. Once again, the investigation stalled, but detectives refused to give up. If technology wasn't going to expose Marshall, someone close to him just might. And there was one person investigators still needed to interview: his stepfather, the owner of the house. The same man Marshall claimed had been home the night Alexis disappeared. If that story was true, his stepfather could confirm everything. If it wasn't, Marshall's entire timeline would collapse. Detectives had no idea. They were only hours away from discovering their suspect's first major lie. The next stop was obvious. If Marshall's version of events was true, his stepfather should be able to confirm every detail. After all, Marshall had repeatedly claimed that someone else was home the night Alexis disappeared. That meant detectives weren't just looking for another witness. They were looking for someone who could either support Marshall's story or completely destroy it. When investigators arrived at the house, Marshall wasn't there. Instead, they were greeted by his stepfather. The conversation started casually. Detectives asked whether he remembered seeing Alexis that night. The answer came almost immediately: no. At first, detectives thought he might simply be confused, so they asked again. Different wording, same question, same answer. He couldn't remember Alexis being there at all. That response changed everything. Marshall had clearly told investigators his stepfather was home while Alexis visited. Now, the very person who was supposed to confirm that story was doing the exact opposite. Whether someone was lying or someone was hiding the truth, detectives knew one thing: Marshall's timeline was beginning to collapse. As the interview continued, they shifted the conversation toward Marshall himself. How had he been acting? Did anything seem unusual? His stepfather admitted Marshall appeared upset about Alexis disappearing, but something about the answers felt distant, careful, almost rehearsed. Detectives left with more questions than they had when they arrived, and one question kept repeating inside their minds. If Marshall lied about something this simple, what else had he lied about? While detectives continued following leads, another investigation was happening at the same time. Alexis's family refused to sit back and wait. Every day, they printed flyers, shared posts online, knocked on doors, spoke with neighbors, organized search groups. They weren't willing to let Alexis become just another missing persons case. They wanted answers, and they weren't going to stop until they found them. Ironically, their determination placed even more pressure on investigators. Every passing day without progress made the case harder to solve. Then, the investigation took another unexpected turn. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage collected from businesses and residential cameras along the route where Alexis's car had been abandoned. Frame by frame, they reconstructed the vehicle's final journey, and suddenly, they spotted something investigators had completely overlooked. A person stepped out of Alexis's car. The figure wore dark clothing, their face was concealed, but one detail immediately stood out. The individual was noticeably larger than Alexis. Broader shoulders, longer stride, a masculine build. There was little chance the person walking away was Alexis herself, but detectives didn't stop there. They followed the figure through camera after camera, street after street. Block after block, the person never appeared panicked, never ran, never looked over their shoulder. Instead, they walked with confidence, as if they already knew exactly where they were going. Nearly a mile later, the figure finally disappeared. Not into a random neighborhood, not into the woods, not into another vehicle. The trail ended somewhere detectives never expected. Marshall's mother's house. That single discovery changed the entire investigation overnight. Detectives now believed the masked individual was almost certainly Marshall. If they were right, it meant he had abandoned Alexis's vehicle, then calmly walked to his mother's home, which raised another disturbing possibility. Had someone inside that house helped him? Or had they known all along what had happened? Armed with new evidence, investigators wasted no time. Search warrants were prepared. Additional officers were called in. Forensic specialists assembled their equipment. This would no longer be treated like a missing person investigation. Everything now pointed towards something much darker, a homicide. Early the following morning, multiple police units surrounded Marshall's residence. This time, they weren't there to ask questions. They were there to search every inch of the property. Officers announced themselves, waited, then forced entry room by room. They cleared the house, every closet, every bedroom, every hallway. Marshall was gone, his stepfather was gone. The house was empty, but almost immediately, something caught the officers' attention. Not something they saw, something they smelled. A powerful odor drifted through part of the house. Several experienced officers recognized it instantly. It resembled the unmistakable smell of decomposition. The scent appeared strongest near the laundry room. As investigators followed it, it seemed to rise toward the ceiling, toward the attic. The atmosphere inside the house changed immediately. Every officer understood what that could mean. If a body was hidden above them, this investigation was about to end. Carefully, they opened the attic access. Flashlights swept through the darkness. Insulation, wooden beams, dust. Nothing moved, nothing obvious.